During the past week, I have been putting in meticulous effort to determine if the standard 180-degree rule is in fact the most cinematic look for cinematic motion blur. And guys, after meticulous testing, I have actually discovered that 189.34 degrees is the perfect cinematic shutter angle. Even Quentin Tarantino's footage won't look as good as yours. We got our handy dandy little camera assistant today. How you doing, bud? How you doing? What, can you say something to the camera? Can you say something? No? Nothing? You got nothing? He's not interested. No, guys, in all seriousness, the 180-degree rule for shutter speed is tried and true. It is the 100% recommended way to go. Everyone has not been lying to you. So, yeah, I think that's all we've got for this video. Ozzy, let's wrap this up. You wanna turn her off? Shut her down? You're my assistant today. I think we're done. Did you hear that? That was a burp. No, guys, I'm totally yanking your chain. I 100% agree with the 180-degree shutter rule most of the time. But today I thought about maybe discussing some times when you would break that rule, because in my opinion, after 3 years of filming, there are times when I think that breaking it makes for more cinematic footage than potentially doing other shortcuts to keep it alive. So, welcome back to another video of our Get Cinematic Quick series. Let's dive right on into it. Yo guys, what is going on? Jake Felzine here, back with another video. So again, like I said in the intro, I do agree with, Maddie, Peter, all the big YouTubers that you've watched. They've taught you well. The 180-degree shutter rule is a great way to go for shutter speed. Now, if you've been living under a rock and somehow you landed on my video first, the 180-degree rule simply states that your shutter speed should be roughly double your frame rate. This creates the most cinematic motion blur. That's what I've got going on right now. Christopher Nolan up in here. Everyone always waves their hands in shutter speed videos like, look at all that shutter speed. But today, guys, I thought we would discuss some times when I feel, after doing this for 3 years, editing video for 3 years, when I've actually found that breaking this rule results in a more cinematic look than if you stick to it and maybe do some of the alternatives. So, let's get into those examples right now. So guys, for the first one, we're going to discuss a situation in which you don't have an ND filter. Now again, if you've been living under a rock and you don't know what ND filters are, they're basically just, where's my ND filter? I don't need one today because I'm filming inside. ND filters are basically these glass filters that you can put in front of your camera to essentially lighten or darken your image. That's what they do. And the reason people use them is to help, again, adjust your exposure. The whole reason you would do that is you want to keep that, 1/50th or 180-degree shutter rule, which is a pretty slow shutter. So outside, you're going to have really bright footage, right? And you want to dial it down, get it back. And really, ND filters help with that, as well as potentially cranking your aperture. So instead of shooting at like f2.8, you're going to crank it up to, f22 on a bright sunny day. But then, of course, as you know, you lose that shallow depth of field of view. So I have this as my first exception today. If you need that shallow depth of field of view, and again, it is a very cinematic tool because it draws our viewers' eyes to certain things. You're saying, this is important, this is what you should focus on. If you have infinite focus, we suddenly get into cell phone and GoPro territory. And what are we really doing there? What is really drawing the attention? It just doesn't look as cinemagical as maybe a shallower depth of field of view. So in this particular case, when you really want to draw your viewers' eyes to something, crank that shutter speed. It's gonna look fine. It might be a little jittery, but I think you're gonna be better off because you really need that shallow depth of field to tell your story. So take a hit there. Motion blur won't be quite as blurry, but if you gotta do it and you're really wanting that, razor thin focus to tell your story, this would be my first exception. Also with this, I will say, again, guys, nowadays with cell phones and GoPros and a lot of really good cheap cameras looking very professional, one of the few things that they are lacking is that shallow depth of field of view for videos. Now, phones are able to do it with software for photos, but when it comes to video, we're still not seeing a ton of that in phones, and that's because their sensors are so small, right? The smaller the sensor, the physics get incredibly more complicated to create that shallow depth of field of view. So even though you might not have the most cinematic motion blur, having that razor thin depth of field of view is going to make your video look, more cinematic. It's going to just step up your game and look better than a cell phone or a GoPro. And so maybe the motion blur isn't spot on, but it still probably is going to look more professional if you have to do this. Now again, if you're shooting outside in general, I just recommend getting an ND filter. Like I recently bought this Can-F Concept one for my Sony with my Tamron lens, and I can shoot outside, I think even up to 2.8 on a bright sunny day, and it's absolutely no problem. So that would be my recommendation. But again, if you gotta do it, you gotta do it, and I would recommend it. All right guys, so let's talk about the next time I would break this rule. Now this one is kind of a unique one, but I have noticed a huge difference. Again, this is just shooting lots of video, trying to give you guys some insight. When it comes to B-roll, and not really B-roll videos, but this is the example I have, but a video shot with a clip where you have a lot of particles, so say you're dealing with a lot of smoke maybe, fog, cereal pouring into a bowl, I don't know, powder like from sugar or something like that, like powdered sugar. I have found not to overdo it, but if you crank that shutter a little bit, what you're essentially doing is freezing a sharper image at every, frame of the video. So the reason this is beneficial in these particular instances where maybe you have some particles, if you crank that shutter speed up, you are going to get kind of sharper, higher contrast. The particles are going to come through looking better. And in post, depending on what you're doing, if you're speed ramping or playing around with those particles, color grading, it's probably going to draw a little bit more of attention to it. And I would definitely recommend giving it a try. Now again, is this like hard, fast, set rule you should do this? No, I think the 180-degree rule looks really good on all kinds of motion. But for this particular case, I have found that having that sharper look on these particles, bringing it into post and then being able to decide, okay, do I use DaVinci Resolve, add some motion blur, or do I just leave it? It adds for some flexibility, and typically it makes for a sharper looking image. Again, play around with it, don't overdo it, but it is another time when I have definitely broken the 180-degree rule, and it paid off. Okay, what's our next one? The next time, guys, and this is like a for sure I would recommend it, if you're doing handheld action shots, think Bourne Supremacy, well, any of the Bourne movies, and I don't know, even sometimes the Avengers, I think they do this, up close action. You want to crank that shutter speed because it creates kind of that choppy, jittery, the flow of the video doesn't feel as floaty, and just in general, it's going to look really cool, and it's going to add that suspense and that hype and that drama to what is taking place in the fight. It's a great way to make fight scenes suddenly become way more energized and way more snappy. It adds a feeling to that type of shot. So an example of this, I've done this before, like if I'm shooting a local sports team and I want to do kind of an up close, high energy commercial type vibe with maybe a soccer player, I will occasionally crank that shutter up just a little bit to create kind of that higher energy, higher drama. And really the whole goal is to give the illusion that what they're doing is not floaty, it's quick, it's spontaneous. They have, their muscles are just going and crazy, like if you're doing like a gym video or whatever the case may be, potentially try this because it adds kind of that heightened sense of urgency in your clip potentially. So I would recommend it for handheld action shots. And guys, the last one for today, again, trying to keep this series somewhat short. This one's kind of gotten a little bit long. This relates to our last video that we talked about, which is exposing for those highlights. If you've got ND filters, if you've got your ISO turned all the way down, but you still want that super wide open aperture, and for some reason those highlights are still not exposed where you want them because you're going for that look that we talked about last week, get a little creative, maybe try cranking the shutter. I've done it before, and again, depending on how high you have to go, it's really not going to make that much of a difference. So this is just another instance where like I myself have really embraced the higher shutter speed because I want that look. I want to expose for the highlights. I think that looks more cinematic than perfect motion blur, especially if you're like doing a tripod shot and your talent is sitting there, or maybe it's kind of a slower paced video, which is probably going to happen if you're doing that dramatic exposed for the highlights type look. It's just another instance where I would definitely recommend cranking that shutter speed. All right, guys, these videos are supposed to be short, so let's wrap it up right there. That is my sort of rough guide to breaking the 180-degree rule. I think it's very valuable. Use these tips and tricks, try them for yourself, find out what works. Again, filmmaking is all about experimentation and creativity, so don't be afraid to break the rules. Just because everyone says you should do something, try bending it a bit, because then you're going to create something really cool. If everyone was shooting the exact same way, then it just wouldn't be cool. We wouldn't have innovative films. So get creative. But guys, that's all I have for you today. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, everybody love everybody, and don't forget, as always, that creativity comes from constraint. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.